Kia ora koutou, and welcome to this discussion about what we can do as businesses and councils to minimise waste and help meet the objectives of New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan and reach the goal of zero emissions by 2050. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jo Ferry. I'm a Principal Environmental Consultant here at Tonkin & Taylor, working mainly in the waste space, and I'm also the Chair of the Disposal to Land Sector Committee at Wastemans. I have a very keen interest in what goes into our landfills, which obviously is one of the areas that is targeted by the emissions reduction plan. So in the virtual room with me today, I'm joined by Chris Purchas and David Beard. Chris Purchas is Tonkin & Taylor's Sector Director for Waste. He is a Principal Environmental Consultant and Environmental and Waste Strategy Specialist with over 20 years experience in waste and broader sustainability and environmental management issues, including waste strategy, sustainability, waste flow and cost modelling, better business case processes, business waste reduction initiatives, organic waste diversion and environmental policy. So welcome, Chris. David Beard is a partner at Movac. They are a venture capitalist firm that backs exceptional people with world-beating ideas. David joined Movac as a partner in 2006 and has primary responsibility for investment opportunities with a focus on deep tech, high-tech manufacturing, and sustainable and circular technologies. Movac is currently on its fifth funding round, and that is a $250 million technology fund. David is currently on the board of Mint Innovation and NanoLayer, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about a bit later. David is a passionate supporter and advocate for the New Zealand deep tech sector, and in his happy space, he is working closely with founders to commercialize world-leading breakthrough technology. Outside of Movac, David has several advisory roles and participates as a judge and mentor on startup initiatives. So thanks very much for joining us today, David. Okay, so the format for today, there'll be short presentations by Chris and then David, followed by a question and answer session. So please use the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen to enter your questions. You can add those questions throughout the presentation, and we will try and get through as many as we can after we've heard from both Chris and David. The chat function is also there, and I see people already using that, so please feel free to chat with other attendees during the session. And we'll also have a couple of poll questions pop up at the end of Chris and David's presentation, so keep an eye out for those. And just a reminder that today's session is being recorded and a link will be circulated after the session. So please keep that in mind when you're posting your questions and chatting with others. All right, so before I hand you over to Chris and David, I thought it was worth a recap of what's happened in the emissions reduction space in New Zealand of late. So the government has been very busy in this space. The emissions reduction plan that was released in May has its origins in the Zero Carbon Amendment Act that was released in 2019. This act sets out the framework for responding to our commitment to the Paris Agreement. As well as establishing the emissions budget system, it also launched the Climate Change Commission. Since then, there have been lots of reports flying around. If we just move to the next slide, please. And the introduction of a number of initiatives targeted at specific areas of emissions. So emissions reduction plan is billed as the first document to connect across the whole economy. It contains strategies, policies and actions which are intended to set us on the path to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So after all the high-level arm waving of the National Adaptation Plan and the Climate Change Commission, I was looking forward to some tangible actions that I could grab hold of, both as a person who cares about our society and our planet, as well as actions that I could help my clients to implement to ensure the ongoing sustainability of their businesses. And there are over 160 actions for delivery. So the plan is certainly ambitious. It reads like a pep talk to get us all excited about the transformational change that is needed in New Zealand's economy to achieve the government's net zero goal. There's lots of talk about challenges and opportunities, And the plan is definitely aiming high, with ambitions ranging from preventing climate impacts to improving the cost of living for all New Zealanders. It's great to see the connecting of actions across multiple sectors and multiple government agencies, as this has certainly been a challenge for central government in the past. So the part of the plan, next slide, please. The part of the plan that I'm most excited about is the circular economy chapter. There is only so much we can do in the waste industry. After a product has been produced, used, and discarded, the real change needs to come right at the beginning of the process, where products are designed. And this is the space where businesses can make a real change. Some of the exciting ideas in this area include moving the public sector to be more circular and investing in innovation and skill development. Alignment with regulatory systems and business environment is also there, which I'm sure David will have something to say about a bit later. And it wouldn't be an MFE document without an action around data collection, and that appears quite a few times in the report. So the waste sector, the waste chapter itself is fairly predictable. The actions have been well signalled through the recent consultation documents. There's going to be a lot more money in the kitty for investment in the waste sector. And that's pretty exciting. And everything is pointing towards removing organics from landfill. So much so that banning organic waste from landfill is strongly indicated in the document, which is something we all need to keep an eye on. So what can businesses and councils do to make the most of these opportunities that the government is creating? I'm going to hand you over to Chris to get his take on what we can do to reduce New Zealand's carbon emissions.
Great, thanks, Joe. So look, I think the emissions reduction plan has a lot to say about waste, but differs very strongly to the existing policy environment. So if we can just go on to the next slide, this gives us a bit of a summary of some of the documents that have come through. And I'm particularly proud of myself for finding a copy of the 2002 waste strategy, and that's actually a photo of the cover because I couldn't find an electronic version. But there's been a range of policy. But I think it's pretty fair to say that the policy on its own has not created change. And what we're really interested in exploring today is what is the role of business, including investors like David, in translating that policy intent on the ground, into action on the ground. So this is a bit of a selection. It's not exclusive by any sense, but provides not a bad summary of some of the thinking that's gone on in the waste and resource recovery space. A couple of things that I think are worth noting here. Back in 2002, there was quite a bit of discussion around implementing a waste levy, but that wasn't actually enabled until the Waste Minimising Act came in 2008. The 2002 policy discussion was also had a lot to say around things like product stewardship, improving data, as Joe's already mentioned, and also a focus on organic waste. So a lot of similarities to what we're seeing now. So I guess in a sense, what I'm saying is that government sets the intent and articulates that quite clearly, but for a range of reasons, action on the ground hasn't necessarily followed as quickly as we might have wanted to. So I'm interested just to look back in history and see, well, we have had a lot of things happen, a lot of changes occur over the last 15 or 20 years in the waste and resource recovery space. Is there anything we can learn in terms of actually getting some real traction with the emissions reduction plan and some of the supporting waste policy that's going on? Next slide, please. So hopefully if you're active in the waste and resource recovery space, these images and those logos look pretty similar. And the reason I've put these up is these are examples of companies that have seen an opportunity, in this case in the organic waste area, seen an opportunity to take unwanted organic materials and turn them into something of value. So Living Earth was founded by one of the key drivers of the 2002 waste strategy and was well underway as a business before government policy was clear. So they got on, saw the opportunity and made things happen, and then government policy followed in a sense. Dalton simply take bark from log yards and turn that into a compost that is sold across New Zealand. So great business. You could call it waste or resource recovery, but simply a good business taking available materials and delivering products that people are very happy to buy. EnviroFood are similar, taking unwanted material and generating a product that is highly valued by their clients across the horticultural sector. So these are great examples to me of Kiwi businesses taking action. because it's good business and because they can deliver a good outcome from a resource recovery perspective. Their actions have provided groundwork to give government comfort that we can set targets for organic waste recovery and continue to give us comfort in terms of waste strategy and emissions reduction plan that's being worked on or has been published at the moment. Next slide, please. So another example of a business focused on optimisation and process maximising the value of their raw materials is the dairy sector. So this is, I guess, trying to show a little bit of a progression. So originally, dairy sector focused on delivering milk locally and producing butter that was a bit easier to ship. Over time, the sector has found ways to maximise the value of products from milk using a range of byproducts alongside the core products. So we've got the example of milk powder, which means all of a sudden you can export milk. We've got the example of a range of different protein powders, and those are the byproducts from some of the manufacturing processes. And then the right-hand side image there is talking about ethanol, again made from byproducts from product manufacture, moving from a byproduct that need management to a byproduct that actually delivers significant value. So this activity is driven by a focus on reducing wastage and on maximising value. So sounds suspiciously like the circular economy mindset that Joe has referred to already. Can we hop onto the next slide, please? So to me, the key mind shift we're trying to achieve with policy is seeing all materials as potential inputs or products in their own right. So regardless of whether my unwanted materials end up in a waste bin or a recycle bin, this is wastage that represents an opportunity to improve my bottom line if I can remove it. A way of making this a little bit more stark is a typical home builder in New Zealand will produce at least a skip bin full of jib offcuts during the interior fit out. A couple of years ago, that was kind of an interesting little factoid. In the current context with the squeeze on jib, suddenly that becomes a lot more interesting. And that is wastage that we need to be chasing out through design and through construction, again, taking a full circular economy mindset to the picture. So as a business, a key response to current government policy direction should be to chase wastage out of your business. With rising prices for waste disposal and recycling and the potential for banning disposal of some materials, reducing wastage is just a no-brainer. This is your defence to a changing situation for waste and resource recovery. But hopefully this is only a small part of the picture for businesses. The examples I discussed earlier on in terms of the organic waste recovery saw opportunity and generated new economic activity through recovering materials, often leading the discussion at a policy level in New Zealand along the way. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the question might be, of the materials that are available, what new products can we produce that are directly relevant to New Zealanders or even international markets? So left-hand side, we've got crushed concrete, replacing virgin aggregate in many applications. If you're in Auckland, this is a no-brainer, it's business as usual. If you're in Wellington, or many other parts of the country, it's much harder to actually make crushed concrete work for a range of different reasons. Interestingly, the barriers are often more related to willingness of designers and infrastructure owners to accept recycled materials than any issues with their performance. The evidence for this is that Transit New Zealand, a couple of iterations before Waka Kotahi, have developed specifications for recycled crushed concrete in the early 2000s, but virgin aggregate is still the preferred material for most projects. The other images are contrasting compost or vermicompost type products with chemical fertilisers and large-scale growing systems. Both the emissions reduction plan and waste policy flag the capture of organic materials. For processing, we need to be clear on how these types of products fit into New Zealand's growing systems. Key considerations include making it easy for growers to order and apply materials, as well as clear links to nutrient budgets and productivity projections. So a very holistic view. Next slide, please. So another opportunity associated with the circular economy mindset, and I think we might pick this up a little bit later when we start to talk about procurement models, is using resource reuse or recovery mindset to lock in a long-term relationship with customers. So this is just a few examples of a lease or a leasing type model. So again, you're probably familiar with. You get the cup, you pay a little bit for it, you bring it back again and either get your deposit back or use it again for a coffee. So a great way of actually locking people in, trying to lock people in where they go for their next coffee, given that Kiwis will always go for their next coffee. The top image you may be less familiar with. It's a scheme called Waka Aranui, a car leasing scheme for low-income families in Manukau. So not so closely related to resource recovery, although leased and well-maintained vehicles will last longer, ultimately reducing wastage associated with these vehicles. More importantly, this is a current example of delivering the function, transport in this case, rather than the product, meaning that the end-of-life product can be dealt with appropriately. The final image is Wild Clean, a Kiwi startup providing cleaning products with a focus on minimising waste and wastage. They'll sell you various packages with reusable bottles and sachets to make up your own cleaning products. They save on packaging, and through subscription or ad hoc purchasing, maintain a relationship with their customers. So all of the examples involve a commercial response to a commercial opportunity. In some cases, they reflect government policy signals. In some cases, they drive them. So the question is, how can the public sector support or enable businesses to continue to create value or delivering on emissions reduction and resource recovery aims? Looking forward to some of David's comments and looking forward to some of your questions as well. Back to you, Jo.
Great, thanks for that, Chris. Before we pass over to David, we're just going to run a quick poll. Can we have the poll question up, please? All right, so we're interested in people's views on, do you think there are big gaps in the emissions reduction plan? And is there enough information in there to help businesses and councils to make the right decisions? So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that. Please enter your selections now. It's fantastic to see some of those examples that that Chris is bringing up. You know, businesses have been responding to these challenges in recent years, and so hopefully we're going to see more of that happening. Okay, how are we going with some answers there? Okay, the poll is closing now. We shall have answers presently. Oh, pretty split there. So nobody, very few people think that the ERP has all the answers, which I think is probably not a bad thing. And about half of you think that there are lots of gaps there, and half think that it's on the right track. All right, very interesting. Okay, we'll come back to that one after the in the Q&A session. So now we'll hand over to David Beard. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks, Chris, for giving a bit of a top-down view. If we go to the next slide. As Jo mentioned, I'm a venture capitalist for New Zealand's largest venture capital firm, so I've been doing it for about 16 years now. I thought for today I'd probably just focus on effectively our view, which is the bottom-up view, which is what's happening, what am I seeing in the market, and how do I think about growing businesses from the ground up, and a little bit of perspective on that. I think Jo's been through all my bio and stuff like that. So if we go on to the next slide, I think it's sort of important to sort of say, well, we've been doing this for a long time. There's a whole bunch of logo bingos out there of all the companies we've invested in. Some of the key ones, Mint up there, we'll be doing a bit of a deep dive on that in this presentation. But there's other ones with Power by Proxy, and even down to our early days when we were early investors in TradeMe. So if we go on to the next slide. So what's a venture capitalist look at when we're looking at businesses? This is basically all deep tech and biotech, and within that I include all the waste and emissions type of opportunities. I suppose the key thing from my point of view is we generally don't look at today's problems that we're trying to solve. A lot of our solutions aren't going to really hit their straps to 5, 7, 8, 10 years. So we were looking at tomorrow's problems, not today's. And I think the good thing about today looking forward to tomorrow, it's pretty obvious where we're going to be starting to really challenge the world and the environment where we're going. And so for us, looking at tomorrow's world is really simple. We kind of look at things like water. Is there adequate drinking water? Is there clean water? What's the ocean health like? Energy, in terms of how do we create, store and use energy in a sustainable way? Carbon, how do we sequester carbon, and how do we reduce carbon processes, and how do we replace existing processes which generate a lot of carbon? We're looking at a lot of biotech these days, which is actually using microorganisms which can be engineered to do wonderful things like decompose plastics, which you may have heard in the news recently, create new proteins that substitute for meat proteins. And along with that, there's all the whole food sector, which is basically how do you actually reduce food production in terms of the emissions that come from that. Around technology, we basically sort of take a view that every phone and every car you produce should be able to be broken down to its components, and each component being used. We've seen a lot of that in Europe now. And to some extent is infrastructure projects, be it buildings or roads, will eventually have to have some zero carbon, zero waste mandate to it in the next 10 years. So those are kind of like the areas we look at. We look at places which have large TAMs, total addressable markets. Generally, that means we're not looking specifically at New Zealand, we're looking at global solutions. And that's probably the key difference between how we think and work between that and people who have got more specific remits within New Zealand. And then we've got the team, the moat, which is really for us is sustainable competitive advantage. This is really critical for us because if we're going to go through the process of investing in a company for 5 years, we want to make sure that they've got something that's unique and is not easy to be copied. And then the other things is generally looking at a high risk, high return type of process. Some of the companies we've looked at, one we've invested in, but you would have heard of some of these. LanzaTech has been around for over 15 years. It was really the first one that sort of basically started using waste gases from steel mills and coal plants, using microorganisms to eat the gas waste and turn that into biofuel. That's just starting to hit its straps now, and it's got some big plants growing, setting up in China. Then came Avatana, which is looking at the waste from steel mills, the slag that comes off that, and they're able to produce, or are looking to produce, a bunch of byproduct materials which can be reused. The key one is titanium oxide. Zincovery, which is looking at steel galvanization processes and recovering the zinc from that. And the one that we've invested in, we'll do a deep dive, which is Mint, and which is looking to recover precious metals. Its first attack in the market is to use e-waste, which is printed circuit boards, and extracting gold and other precious metals from there. So if we go on to the next slide. In a wider sector, we're also interested in a bunch of things. I noticed on the plan, it's actually sort of things like marketplaces and platforms. So you've got other ones that are just starting up. Toha is a platform which looks at regenerative farming and the environment. And essentially, a lot of the farms these days are run on basically how do you improve the revenue of a farm per acre or per hectare. Whereas Toha is actually it says, well, if you use regenerative farming techniques, it's more about how do you increase profitability for a farm. And you can do that with putting less fertilizer on that. And with less fertilizer, you have less runoff, and actually sort of looking at a more sustainable way of actually doing your farming practices. Carbon Crop is another platform which is looking to account for forest carbons. And the ETS basically records monoculture forests, whereas Carbon Crop uses an AI engine that actually looks at multi-crop or culture forests. So it's able to send a drone up, scan a forest, which may have different types of trees and forestries, and actually do a carbon assessment for that. It's working with big players like New Zealand Wool Board to sort of say, basically, can we generate a zero carbon wool, for instance, by offsetting the wool produced from sheep into, forest carbon. There's a bunch of things around some of the waste reductions. Neocrete looking at a carbon neutral concrete. Cytogenics is actually looking to boost anaerobic digesters, so they produce 40% more renewable gas. They're making some great strides over especially at the moment, over in Europe, obviously where there's a bit of an energy crisis. And then there's energy and transports, which is a couple there, which is looking towards hydrogen. And I think the big one, which from my point of view, which is actually a lot of our emissions come from, our primary industries, and to some extent, alternate food and proteins, which is, modified organisms. In this case, for Morocco, it modifies the plant and grows plants which have animal proteins in them, and Daisy Lab, which is a precision fermentation, which uses microorganisms, very much like a brewery that ferments and generates from there. So there's quite a broad sector of things that we're interested in. I would say if you look at where things are going to be in 10 years' time, some of these things start to make a lot of sense going forward. Next slide. We take a quick deep dive into Mint, which is something we invested first in 2017. What we like about Mint is it's basically a low carbon process to recycle. Initially, it's just e-waste it's looking at, which is all the printed circuit boards. The current process is half of them get tipped into landfill because there's just no laws and regulations that allow them to, prevent them from doing that. Most of that's coming in. Most countries now are beginning to accept they need to be collected and recycled. The current process of recycling them is to send them on a ship and put them into a smelter plant up into Asia, and then take the precious metals from there. Typically within a circuit board, you get copper, tin, palladium, silver, gold, and other processes go from there. Next slide. Some of the use and recycling figures for me are quite staggering compared to, say, this is per kilogram of gold produced, and the obvious one, which is how does it produce compared recycling it using a mint plant versus mining. And if you just look at the energy figures, the CO2 figures, so it uses 40 times less energy than mining it, 10 times less CO2 than mining. The actual water content is 40 times less water, and then 250 times less wastage, and just waste materials coming on from there. Smelter plants, there's still a large difference in terms of CO2 produced from there. We have no information around how much waste and environmental impact smelter plants have. They're incredibly protective about what their outputs might be, and how much they sort of, where those externalities go. But that's the best guess, and it's even way better on CO2, 3 times better on CO2 than smelter plants. So net, this is a really good circular business where it actually does a lot of good to recycle circuit boards locally. Next slide. So if we work out a plant saves about, each plant that we set up, and we're setting up the first production plant in Sydney that goes into commission by the end of the year, we'll save about 12 tons of CO2. It'll recycle 500 kilograms of gold and generate in that process $40 million revenue at 20% margin. So not only is it a good business economics on that, but if you look at the carbon economics on it, it's fantastic as well. So if we go to the next slide. What Mint want to do over the next 24 months is build 15 plants. And this is where it starts getting exciting. So in the next 24 months, of those 15 plants, you'll basically have an installation capacity of processing 60,000 tons of e-waste that will save 200,000 tons of carbon and produce revenue about $600 million. Each plant to set up costs about $10 million. From our point of view, that's just the start. We really much see that these are city scale plants, that in every major city, you should be able to take your recycling through to a local city reprocessor and get your e-waste recycled into the various precious metals that come from there. The company's also looking at recycling lithium-ion batteries and taking out the lithium, cobalt, nickel from there. And it's also got demo scale proof of getting catalytic converters from car exhaust and taking the palladium and platinum out of that as well. Next slide. So yeah, Mint's a really good example of something we get really excited about. You know, part of the journey for all startups, so I've got a couple of key things coming up there is, you know, startups aren't waiting. They're not looking for some act to tell them to do that. We see from our things, especially the younger people coming out of university, you know, they feel compelled. They know it's their future, and they're compelled to be part of the change. So they're not waiting for somebody to pull them along. We're getting dragged by them, and we're being challenged to think the way they think, and that's really encouraging to sort of see generations of people sort of stepping up and stepping forward. And you know, I think the way they look at that is they're not constrained. You know, like governments and councils and corporates. You know, when you get into those positions, you know, it's difficult because there's concerns around how do I address failure and risk into some of these opportunities, whereas they don't have that. You know, they don't have any committees trying to decide what the best outcomes are, and trying to design best outcomes through committees is never a great process. And they don't have a high degree of authorizations or working groups and all those things which sort of clutter and slow down and things from there. And the big one is, at the end of the day, they're not scared of immediate fallout. If things go belly up, then so be it. And, you know, so they don't have to worry about necessarily what the press would say if you're a government, a local or central, or if you're a large corporate. I think, you know, we over-index in New Zealand around this fear for failure, and that impedes progress significantly in this country. And they'll attempt to do this either with or without our help going forward. I think the key messages to all you folk out there is, you know, we're all involved where startups want to do stuff. So we need to decide whether we're part of a headwind or a tailwind to that process. So if we go to my last slide, these are some of the sort of headwinds and tailwinds, which, you know, I've experienced within in trying to get startups through. There's obviously regulatory headwinds and tailwinds. At the moment, they're mainly headwinds. You know, they're all levels, they're national, local. There's even things like there's, you know, the bioengineering sort of headwind. You know, I think we need to start questioning things around what used to be, around what we can and can't do around genetic modification. If we're to sort of solve some of the problems, like how do you get plastics that can be digested by a bug, we're going to need to do genetic modification. I think, you know, we need to open out some of our thinking, which has been quite shut down for a number of decades. And the question also even is things like, I know it might flare people up, is we might even need to think our nuclear stance. Nuclear is a lot safer than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And a lot of our stance is a bit of a Cold War stance around, you know, having these nuclear bombs and things like that. You know, if you look at where that's going, it's possible, possibly within the next 20 years, we actually may have a nuclear powered car or a nuclear powered phone. And then we won't have to worry with all these batteries and how they're manufactured. And, you know, with a few changes in what they're doing, they're getting micro nuclear plants now, which are, you know, going to be significantly safer. Startups don't like bureaucracy. They're not experts at form filling. They don't understand, and they don't fit into a lot of large organizations and how they work. So, you know, being a part of the headwind is to try and make it for startups to kind of get what they need with the least amount of bureaucracy in that process. The other thing is financial. You know, if we look offshore, we generally find there's significantly more grants. There's better tax incentives for investment into early stage businesses. And there's often debt facilities that, you know, as a plant might want to go from, you know, a pilot plant to a first production plant. There's a lot more debt facilities available offshore. I think the challenge for New Zealand is to at least be equal with some of the offshore side of things. You know, and the two ones I'll give is, for instance, Mint got a $4 million Australian grant to assist in the build of its production facilities. Over in the UK, for instance, on the tax side, you're able to offset your losses on early stage businesses as an individual investor, and you have limited amount of, they have capital gains over there, and you have an offset on capital gains as well. That leads to a huge amount of investment into the space. And if we can get more investment into it, then we get more chance of opportunities. For people out there with labs and equipment and resources, helping startups to reduce their burden at the beginning is great. Participation and willing to pilot new technologies is absolutely fantastic. And to be a reference customer would be absolutely superb. So things that we could do quite simply is just lean in. And when you get these opportunities to help some of these startups, rather than sort of being possibly a bit of a headwind, sort of look at how you can be the tailwind for that process. And as I say, the final thing is some of these things are, startups always have a problem with scaling. So any assistance in how that can do is always really good. They generally are square peg and round holes. Everybody's been set up in sort of government and corporates to think in a very structured way. These guys don't, and that works to their advantage. So we just got to always sort of take the fact that they're always going to be a little bit quirky in terms of how do you fit them into your organization. And the last one is just sort of look at how your processes and products may be designed just to favor a few large organizations. And often they're being built in. The oligopolies have sort of kind of have processes that make it hard. I mean, the most recent one is obviously the jib, where it gets specified as jib board or Gibraltar board, which is a branded one. And therefore it doesn't easily allow other alternative products to be used and substitute because it's been designed and specified in. So, overall, I don't think people need to do much. Just look at leaning in. It's kind of my end statement on that.
Fantastic. Thanks for all those insights, David. It's fantastic to see so many startups getting out there and having these great ideas about solving tomorrow's problems. Yeah, exciting. Okay, so we've turned David's last slide into a poll, which we're going to bring up now. And this is around what are the main things that that central government could do to encourage your organisation to take action. So whether you're a council or a private business, what are the key things that you think they need to get right so that we can turn some of these headwinds into tailwinds and get some great change happening? So we'll just give you a few minutes to complete that. And then we will get on to the Q&A. So if everyone can please put your questions in the Q&A. We've got a couple coming through, so we can make a start on those once the poll closes. I think that's probably about enough time. Let's see. Oh, a good spread there. So the top contenders about getting the regulation right. Financial support. So David talked about that one. And creating an environment that encourages participation. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of the old way of thinking still in the industry, which we could probably do a lot better on, getting around the table more. All right, thanks for all those great insights. So let's get us started. And thanks, Paul, for your question about what are our panelists' views on the first poll question. So yes, that was exactly where I was going to start. So if we start with you, Chris, what do you think are the gaps in the emissions reduction plan, and how could the government do better there, or what can we do about that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think for me, probably the biggest gap is actually thinking about, in a resource recovery perspective, is thinking about where materials might go. So the focus on the circular economy is really positive in that regard. But if we look at things like construction and demolition materials or organic materials, there's a real focus on capture and diversion, but less of an understanding around how they might actually be made, the materials might be made use of. So I think that's a real gap, and that leads you into discussions around risk allocation, some of the regenerative agriculture things that Dave talked about, as well as some of the work that's going on in other parts of government. So I think in some senses, recovery of materials was not as joined up with the use of the products as I might have liked to have seen.
Okay, yep, that's a good one. So what about you, David? Do you see any big gaps in there?
Yeah, probably similarly to Chris. Like if I take a real working example in mint, one of its byproducts, well, it's got two byproducts. One is gypsum, which funny enough is out of all the processes. And so what it wants to do is try and, if it doesn't get outside of the precious metals, it wants innate products that can actually then be used. So one of those is gypsum. So obviously, how do you feed what will end up being, it won't be a huge amount, it's not like it's mining it, but how do you feed some of these trickle feed byproducts into an existing system so that they can then accept them? And what you get there is usually, oh, well, I don't know about that. And, then we have to respecify it and things like that. The other stuff, which is just the actual green circuit board, is an innate material. It's hard, it's dense. It could actually be used for roading fill at a certain proportion and things like that. But again, it's trying to actually sort of say, how do we use, obviously you've got the valuable byproducts from a circular economy, but how do you use the innate materials in a really sensible way, rather than actually using other innate materials that you just dig out of the ground and just throw in there because that's the way you've always done it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we've got specifications that are saying virgin material, or we need to move more to a performance-based specification, don't we? That where use a product that meets this, can do this thing, not is made of this material. Yeah, that would certainly help. Okay, so next question here is from James. He's saying, thanks for the excellent discussion so far. What can we expect over the next 10 years in terms of changes to A, volume sent to landfill, and B, unit landfill costs? Chris, this is one for you.
Kind of the $1 million question. But look, I think what's been really interesting over the last probably 20 years, or certainly since we've had better data around landfill disposal, has been that while we've increased our recovery of materials, the landfill disposal numbers have remained pretty consistent. So the total quantity of waste we're generating is increasing, but we're recovering more of it. I'd like to think that we'll start to bite into the disposal of materials, because the other tension that we have is economic development. So as we continue to consume and construct, we generate waste, and as our economy grows, we will generate more waste in that regard. So I'd like to see, my best guess would be a downwards trend, but probably not as accelerated as we might like. In part, that will be driven by the second part of the question, which is around the cost of disposal. Clearly, there's programmed increases from a policy perspective, both waste levy and from an emissions trading scheme impact on landfill disposal costs. But there's also just the cost of doing business. And I mean, we've seen transport costs go in one direction, and it's hard to see them reversing, particularly materially. And as we increasingly centralise disposal facilities, things like disposal, transport costs are going to become increasingly significant as well. I think what does have the potential to have a material impact on materials placed in landfill is some of the big investment money that government is signalling is coming from the waste levy funding in particular. So if those investments are well targeted and well implemented, then we could see a significant drop. But I think it remains to be seen what the plan is and how effectively that plan will be implemented.
Absolutely. The statistics at the moment are that organic material makes up 30 or 40% of what goes into landfills. So if we do manage to remove that from landfills, then that's going to change the game quite significantly.
I think the material risk there is that we produce take a whole lot of organic waste, turn it into something and desperately hope that somebody wants it, as opposed to looking at available organic materials and then look at the potential users and design products that are exactly what people want, whether that's in the agricultural sector, whether that's in horticulture, which is a key market at the moment, or other areas, and also looking at opportunities to have kind of intervening products, if you like. So the struvite that Watercare have just started producing from some of their biosolids products is a great example of actually extracting high value materials and then dealing with the residual maybe in a different way.
Great, thanks for that, Chris. Okay, now let's have a question for Dave here. You mentioned that the New Zealand environment is different from overseas in a financial way. What else is different about the New Zealand environment, and how what could we do to encourage startups and encourage innovation in the waste reuse space?
Yeah, I think where New Zealand's unique is, I suppose, we're small enough that we've kidded ourselves for a long period of time that we're green. And it seems to proliferate. I mean, we hear all the tourist messages that say we're green, and we do that. To the extent our smallness means that our problems aren't as big as other countries and bigger populations. And so we've quietly sort of like shuffled some of these problems aside, because if you add it up across a population of 5 million, it doesn't, you can kind of hide it quite well under the carpet. If you places like Singapore and even Australia now and things like that, it's just not possible. So what they do, I suppose, if you look at Europe and some places in Asia and places like that, is regulation has come in, and it's coming in even harder, even faster. And to some extent, that's the biggest tailwind that any startup can ever have, is when people are told they have to do it. And then they sort of say, well, actually, there's the stick. Now here the carrot is, and here's some finance and grants that actually help things happen. So when you put that on an individual council or a central government or on a large corporate or something like that, it encourages them to sort of say, well, actually, staying still is not an option. And that, to me, creates the right set of incentives, which, from our point of view, sort of says that generally we find that there is always somebody who is pushing that harder and faster overseas than they are in New Zealand. And, the biggest thing that we could change would be complacency.
Great. Yeah, that's a strong message for everyone. Yeah. Okay, so here's another question from James. What have been the most radical disruptions in waste management overseas, and are we likely to see similar disruptions in New Zealand? Chris, maybe
yeah,
got
it's a
on that.
Really, really good question. I think what we're seeing is a lot of innovation, and I think it's really really pleasing to see that some of that's actually occurring in New Zealand through people like Movac actually supporting the innovators. But I think the reality is, at a large scale, is that a lot of change is driven by heavy regulation, as David's just alluded to, and that just hasn't been the way that we do things here in New Zealand. So I think there's some real disconnects between what we might see happening elsewhere and what might occur here. If we look at the UK and a drive into anaerobic digestion, for example, that's been driven by renewable energy subsidies and landfill directive back in the day around organic waste to landfill. So until we start to see some interventions driving activity, I think what we will continue to see is some of the, in a sense, peripheral opportunities where there are real commercial opportunities. Mint's a great example of that. We've talked around things like some of the construction wastes and organic materials where there is a business model that works today. So I think in terms of disruptions, I think there's a lot of potential in the data space. We've talked for years about data. I think there's a lot more information. The big challenge at the moment is we don't quite know what to do with it and use the insights to actually drive our decision making. So that's probably where I see the most opportunity in a New Zealand context, is leveraging the information we're collecting.
Anything to add to that, David?
No, I think, from overseas, what you start seeing is, as I talk to things like the car industry in Europe, where you can't produce a component that can't be recycled, where everybody has the right to buy a product and send its packaging back to the shop, and it becomes the shop's problem. And so these circular, if you do follow the circular in terms of circulate the problem rather than the solution, if you circulate the problem back to the people who produce the product, then you start changing things. And that's what I like around some of the EU stuff is, if you want to reduce packaging, actually it ends up back, supermarket sends it back to, maybe to the manufacturer, or by and large, the supermarket will put pressure on the manufacturer to actually say, hey man, I'm getting all this shit and I can't deal with it. So reduce your packaging, or I'll go to somebody else who can. And with car manufacturing, the fact is everything in there, even the bits of plastic being melted down, remolded, reused in some shape or form, goes to Chris's point where they design something with a second life purpose to it. And so, that's a really good example I think we could take out of all manufacturing in New Zealand to sort of say, where's its afterlife, and how does that how do I build it now, and what materials that it will have an afterlife somewhere.
And do you think we're likely to get there without regulation?
Do you want to take that one, Chris?
Enough will in the industry to do that?
Look, I think there is will in parts of the business sector, and I think some of the examples I chucked up are good examples of people saying we're just going to get on with it. And I guess my perception in New Zealand, having observed for a few years now, is that typically what you will get is some people going and playing in this space, and that will give government enough courage to then maybe think about regulating possibly. So I think that's probably how it plays out here. I think if you're waiting for regulation to underpin your business model in New Zealand, you're probably taking the wrong approach.
So good encouragement.
My pro tip would be, I think we'll all move along at a pace, and that can be anything from slow to medium pace. Let's not kid ourselves. They will be a compelling event over the next 5 or 10 years. And it will be of such a magnitude, it will force change in people. So we're on some sort of time clock there. I don't know, and I don't want to be a naysayer because I'm a futurist, but to some extent, I believe the answer's all solvable. But whether it's sort of like half of the Antarctic shelf falls off and we've got literally 5 years before the sea level raises 3 meters or something like that, or New York gets swamped out with a tsunami and kills 2 million people or something like that, these will be events which are so catastrophic that it will cause change, like COVID causes change, like war causes change. We will have this sort of event. So to some extent, we will go along at pace A and get to as best we can, and then this event will happen. And we will all need to find a third or fourth or fifth gear, which we're going to have to sort of throw risk out the window and take a lot more risk in terms of what we need to do to get to a stable state, in our environment going forward.
I think
sorry to be the doom and gloom, but
that whole discussion around risk is really important, I think, even in today's world from a public sector perspective. So Mark asked a question around recycled concrete in particular and why that's not specified. And I think it kind of speaks to a much broader issue, and it comes back to the gypsum out of mint as well, is that we tend to go with the lowest risk option, something we're sure is going to operate. So I think there's a real opportunity for the public sector and others to provide room for people to do things that are a little bit risky. And there's a range of ways that you can actually manage the downsides of that. But actually being prepared to take a punt on things and allow people to try new things is critically important. Because if we keep doing the same things, I've got a sneaking suspicion that we'll get a pretty similar outcome. And that's probably not where we want to be.
Absolutely. No, the time is now to take action. All right. Well, we are almost done. So let's see if we've got one more question we can talk about here. So there's a question around food rescue rescuing surplus food. Yep. Yeah. Can you respond to that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's not about the cause necessarily. The reasons why we don't do service investments is the main problem is really scaling people. And when you're a technologist, what you want to do is build once a product and then find the easiest way to repeat it and go from there. Scaling people, as I've done similarly with Deloitte, where a management consultant, is a really difficult task because you can't create the same version of everything going forward. So if you had the food rescue in one branch or one location, it would possibly end up being a different service in a different one. And then as you get different services at different qualities, it affects how your business can progress. The time to hire the right people, the time to train them and things like that just doesn't meet within our high growth profile. So there's nothing wrong with service businesses. I've worked in a lot of successful ones. It's just typically things that we don't invest in as a venture capital high growth company.
All right. Okay. Well, we are at the end of our hour. So thank you very much for everyone who has joined and participated in the polls and with the questions. And thanks very much to Chris and to David for your great presentations and great insights on this subject. There is definitely lots of work to be done. So yeah, I hope everybody has got their pep talk now and are ready to take some action. So thanks everyone. We'll see you later.